And it came to pass that Thomas Hunter fell from a building in Denver, Colorado, and crossed over to the future Earth, where he awoke in the Forbidden Circle. Escaping the Black Forest, beaten and torn, he was healed by Elion's fruit at the hand of a beautiful maiden named Rochelle. And there, in the land of living water and the great romance, Thomas embraced new life with Elion. But he was from the histories, where evil blackened men's hearts. Tanis, the firstborn, was drawn by that evil and crossed into the Forbidden Circle to learn of it. When he did, the scourge of Tile and his evil Shataiki was released to ravage the land. Everything would change. So it was that Elion's children were consumed by the disease of evil, which covered their flesh and minds. But in his mercy, the Creator led Thomas of Hunter and those who would follow him to 7 lakes in 7 green forests, where they could wash to keep the disease away. Those who followed Elion became known as the Forest Dwellers, but they were few. Those who waged war against them lived in the desert and became known as the Horde, and they were as many as the sands in the desert. But Elion left the Forest Dwellers with a promise that a way would be made to defeat evil when all hope seemed lost. Brothers of the Great Gathering, sisters of the song and dance, today we gather because we, like Thomas and Rochelle, and all who will one day follow Elion, know that the way was made. When all hope was lost, when the darkness had swallowed the forests and the disease had turned the last man, woman, and child to horde, one hero came to save the world. He was despised and rejected by men. He came unto his own, but his own did not receive him. He was a great warrior who loved more than any man could love, and he would be the savior of all who would drown in that love. He was Elion.
In one world, 15 years have passed. But in the other world, it's only been a few minutes. Red takes us right back into the life of Thomas Hunter as he straddles 2 worlds and seeks to find a way to save each of them. At the end of Black, the Shataiki had overtaken the colored forest and only a few had managed to escape. But those that did reached pools of water that Elion had created for them. 7 different lakes, 7 different communities. And they were told that every day they were to bathe in these lakes, or else they would become like those who were not able to get to the lakes. And they were told that every day they needed to bathe in these lakes to keep themselves pure. If they did not, then their skin would get this disease called the Horde. Their skin would become cracked and dry, and their mind would become dull. They would slow down. They would become almost zombie-like in their appearance. Red picks up 15 years into this new reality. They're a small contingent of people called the Forest Dwellers. They live in the forest. They live in these, no longer a colored forest, but just a regular forest, just with this life-giving water, that with this water from these lakes, they're able to keep themselves pure day after day after day. There's like this an oasis that they have to live in and defend and keep themselves from harm. Meanwhile, much of the rest of the world has turned into Horde. They've have this scabbing disease that covers their body, covers their skin, causes their skin to flake and to crack. And most of all, it has turned them away from any sort of worship of Elion. Dekker's symbolism moves here from creation and the fall to all of the Old Testament ritual and sacrificial system and religion. We're introduced to a other Earth that is vastly different than the one that we saw in Black. We are introduced to a world at war. We are introduced to a world where there are 2 types of people, Forest Dweller and Scab. We are introduced to a world where there are 2 types of people, Forest Dweller and Scab, and each are committed to the destruction of the other. While occasionally you would see some defect from the Horde, and bathe in the lakes, it really wasn't that common. More often you would see those leave the circle, leave the forests, and become horde, either because they stayed out for too long, either because they stayed out too long and they became horde without really realizing or wanting to because they had been captured and were not able to bathe in the water for whatever reason. They just walked away. You see these two contentions. It's really us versus the world. In 15 years of living in this existence, Thomas Hunter has moved from being a young man with no knowledge of what's going on to now he really is the leader of the Circle in this new world. And he leads the people for their own safety. He fights against the scabs led by the great General Kurang. And the imagery and the symbolism that's brought up is really this depiction of Old Testament Israel and their relation to all of the nations that are surrounding them. Meanwhile, in our reality, Thomas is able to convince people of the reality of the disease, the reality of the virus. It begins to spread. It begins to overtake the earth. And the nations of the world are in a panic. They're at a loss of what to do. Only Thomas Hunter can track down a potential antivirus and save the world. And he has to do this with the help of Monique de Raison, who is the creator of the Raison strain, who is the person who is responsible for a vaccine, yes, but also holds within her head the knowledge of an antivirus that could undo the effects of this vaccine. Because of this, then the terrorists kidnap Monique. So in this Earth, Thomas Hunter is using the skills acquired in other Earth to track her down, to find her, and to rescue her, all with the intended goal of getting the antivirus into the hands of people that can save the world. The real story of Red, though, is not in real Earth, which sort of just serves to continue the storyline to prepare it for its conclusion and its climax in white. Where Red shines and where it's supposed to shine is the way in which it portrays this new world and other Earth. Because in this world, Thomas thinks that he has things figured out. He thinks he knows what he is supposed to do. When he begins dreaming again, he uses knowledge from this Earth to create an explosive that helps him take down the Horde. He has been told by Elion that in one blow that Elion will destroy the Horde. He becomes convinced that he's talking about some sort of explosives, that only when the Horde is defeated then will Elion come back and restore the world to the bliss of the Collared Forest. But unknown to him, Elion has a much different plan. Dekker introduces us to a man named Justin. We see Justin as someone who sort of straddles these two worlds. He is part of the Circle. He is a forest dweller, but he has defected from Thomas Hunter's army. He has chosen no longer to fight against the Horde, but he teaches a message of love and reconciliation, that we are to love the Horde and we are to bring them into this family of the Circle. His teachings are considered blasphemous by many, and especially the religion of the Circle, headed by a man named Cephas, sees him as being a heretic and seeks to cast him out. All of this comes to a head when Justin is formally sent before the council, and in front of all of the forest dwellers, he is asked to state his case. There's a big climactic battle. There's a great reveal of one of the characters of one of the Horde generals not being a person that you thought he was. The great General Kurang being somebody that you know from Black. The story wraps around and showing you that even the people that you thought you knew, it brings a humanity to the Horde that you may not have thought of before. Now you may think it's obvious, I may think it's obvious who this Justin character is, but there are several people who have told me when they first read this book, and these are people that grew up in the church, that were committed Christians, that the way in which Ted writes the Justin character, that it is way late in the story before you begin to understand who he really is, that this is a representation of Jesus. Jesus is Elion, and he is the boy, and he is Justin, and he has called us to love those who are different than us. That just as Jesus came in and he said that you should love your enemies the way that you love yourself, so too Justin comes in and he says that we should love the horde, that we should treat them well, that we should, and this is in defiance to the entire religion that has been set up in these past 15 years. The Circle has built a religion based around ritual, namely the ritual of bathing in the waters. And this becomes a symbol for all the Old Testament rituals and sacrificial system that you would have to do, that every day you would have to sacrifice in some way, in some sort of way. And it was in this way the Old Testament Jews thought that you would be saved. Dekker takes that imagery and he packs it into the symbolism of bathing in a lake. That if you come back and you purify yourself day after day after day, then you can remain in right standing with Elion. But it's just a ritual, and it's not something, it's something that you have to return to again and again and again. And in this new way of being that Justin is calling the people to, he is calling them to a new life in a way that they will no longer be tethered to this daily ritual. That this daily ritual had its purpose, but now he's going to bring it to something new in all fruition that's going to bring in Circle Dweller and Horde alike. Red is subtitled The Heroic Rescue, and this is about Justin coming to rescue his people, about Elion coming to rescue his bride and create a way of redemption and create a way of salvation. And the way that Dekker presents this is absolutely incredible, that he sets up in sort of almost like a stadium kind of event where Justin is handed over to the horde and handed over to the religious leaders of the Circle to be drowned. The circle finds themselves so pressed in by the horde, who vastly outnumber them, that the horde is going to destroy every last one of them unless they hand over Justin, unless they hand over a man who's been deemed to be a traitor, unless they sentence him to death. And so in this lake of Elion that the people bathe in every day to achieve their ritual purity, the horde beat and batter and then drown Justin. And upon his death, the waters of that lake turn blood red, and it becomes this image of the cross. It becomes this image of redemption, but more than that, and we were called to follow that. And just as Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me, Elion calls his people to drown with him in these waters. It's a beautiful scene. It's a terrifying scene. It scares us to see in such vivid reality what we are called to do in our own lives. You know, it's one thing to be told, oh, give your life over to God, give your life over to Jesus, live your life for him. It's another thing to, like, in a fictional book, to say that this character drowns, this character dies to themselves, this character is committed to following their creator in such a drastic way. And when they come up out of the water, they find themselves redeemed, not just for one day, but for all of eternity. Let me read to you just a part of this. Rochelle, she grabbed his arm and spoke hurriedly. Listen to me, Thomas. I think I understand what he meant. He said it would bring me life. He said he knew that we would need life. He knew that he would die. He knew that the lake would no longer give us life because it would be defiled by the shedding of innocent blood. His blood. The lone figure walking toward them faded from his vision. Die with me. We've died with him already, he said. Look at us. He said it would bring us life. Martin's face was shrouded by his hood. He carried his sword loose by his side, overconfident, taunting. Thomas looked at the lake, at the sea of red that sent chills down his spine. Justin's message suddenly seemed quite obvious to him. He couldn't imagine doing it, but if Rochelle was right, Justin had asked them to die as he had died. He'd asked them to drown in the sea of red. Thomas had swam through a sea of red once, deep in the emerald lake that could be breathed. A fresh cry erupted from the shore. Evidently, Cephas had failed in his task to prove that all was still fine with his leg. But there was more. Cephas was screaming above the chaos, "He's gone! There's no body! They've taken him!" I want to submit to you that there has never been in fiction more powerful imagery of the cross and of redemption than in this book. It is a supremely powerful retelling of the gospel message. It is an incredibly complex and symbolic story of dying to self to live for Christ. It is, to me, every time that I read this, every time that I listen to the audio version of this, it just gives me chills every single time. When I read audiobooks, when I listen to audiobooks, I tend to put it on about double speed so that it doesn't take quite so long. And I found myself, I had to stop, I had to rewind, I had to listen to this in real time. I had to find myself be changed by it. This is something I tend to be doing other things if I'm listening to audiobooks. And I was repainting my house actually the last time that I was going through the series. And I just ended up sitting on a ladder for like 15 minutes, just sitting at the top of the ladder, about 12 feet up in the air, headphones on, head bowed, just in awe, just taking it in. And no matter how many times I come back to this story, I find myself changed by it. That's the power of story. That's the power of story. But even here, this isn't the end. This ends with the worlds on a brink. Real Earth stands at the precipice of nuclear holocaust. Other Earth stands with the decision of whether or not people are going to follow Justin and die with him. The answer to all of that comes in white.